Hello everyone. Today is Monday, April 22nd, and we are going to finish up this memory quilt today. It's going to be a long day, but it's probably my most favorite part of making a quilt. There is the quilt top all on the wall, and that's all done and put together. I think it turned out fantastic. This is a memory quilt made with clothing, with the blocks put on point with sashing. So I think that's fantastic. I love it. So today I need to run down and grab some materials to finish up this quilt. I'll be purchasing 6 yards of backing and 2 packages of 80/20 batting. She wanted to do 2 layers of batting in her quilt. And then some other small things for another project I'm starting tomorrow. I start a new quilt tomorrow. Can you believe that? So today is going to be a long day, but it's going to be a lot of fun. So let me show you the color for the back. When my client came for her quilt appointment, she saw this quilt that I had made previously over in the corner, and she loved the color of this t-shirt block. So we are going to go with that color. I'm going to bring this quilt right with me down to the fabric shop, and I will match up as close as I possibly can to this magenta color. It might not be showing magenta in the camera, I'm not sure. And so I'll be purchasing that. This quilt top finished at 68.5 inches wide and 85 inches long. And so here's what we're going to do today. I need to go buy those materials. I will sew together the backing and get the backing and the batting and the top loaded onto my quilting frame. I will quilt her quilt with an all over meandering stitch, much like the one on this t-shirt quilt right here. So that's nice. She'll be able to wash and dry her quilt in the dryer and the washer. And then I need to make some binding for this quilt. I figured out that I need 8 strips of binding to do her quilt. I'm going to make a custom tag out of the magenta fabric that I purchased, and so I'll be adding a tag onto the back of her quilt, and then we will bind this quilt. So I thought it would be fun. Once I get everything loaded onto the frame, I'll show you parts of the quilting process, and then maybe spend some time with you while we bind this quilt. It really all depends on how my time is going today, so we shall see, but I would love to spend some time with you as we finish up this memory quilt today. Here we are. The quilt is loaded on the frame. So I went to Joann's and I found the perfect color backing that was the closest to the t-shirt material that she really liked. And I purchased 2 packages of 80/20 batting, and that's what she requested. And I have this quilt loaded onto the frame. It's just pinned in place. I'm getting ready to start the quilting, and this is just floating on top. So I think the hardest part of today in quilting this quilt will to make sure that these 2 layers of batting stay nice and flat in between the back and this quilt top, as it's all stuffed down below. And I just want to make sure and be careful that it doesn't get bunched up and there's no lumps or wrinkles. That's just needs to be quilted. That there's no lumps or anything in the middle of this quilt. So I think I'll go ahead and base this and start quilting, and I'll bring you along for part of the quilting. We're just going to do a simple I would say medium-sized meandering. It's not going to be really large or really tight and small. It's just a good average, good size meandering stitch to quilt this quilt. You'll notice I quilt barefooted. I'm going to go ahead and get started on the left side of the quilt. And again, I'm just doing a simple, looser, medium-sized meandering stitch on this quilt. Nothing fancy to take away from the importance of the clothing, but really just a utilitarian quilting stitch so that she can really use the quilt and wash the quilt, and the quilting will hold up and all of the batting will stay exactly where it's supposed to throughout the years. Usually when I start a quilt on the first pass, I like to usually go along the bottom from left to right and then go back and fill in the top area. So that's what I'm going to do on this pass, is go about halfway up all the way from the left to the right, and then quilt in the top area back to where we started. On these quilts you have to be really careful not to quilt over top of buttons like right here in this corner. You can see I'm just pressing the quilt in several areas just to make sure that any fullness is worked into the quilting. And I have to be really careful with this pink shirt because it has ruffles and pleats that are built into the collar, and I want to make sure that those stay nice and pretty as I quilt them. Now I'm just working my way back to the left side of the quilt. I usually like to put on some music and enjoy this part of the process. This is probably the most enjoyable part of making a quilt for me. That, and when someone picks up their quilt, I think that has to be the best part of making a memory quilt. So I'll just go back all the way over to the beginning where I started, and then I'll advance the quilt and I'll show you the next section as it's quilted. Now that the first pass on the quilt is all completed, I've advanced the quilt and rolled it up on the top bar, and now we're going to do the second section of this quilt. On this section you'll see that I work in bigger chunks from the bottom bar up to the top bar. Usually after that first section has been quilted and advanced, I'm pretty confident that the quilt is going to remain straight. I'm floating this quilt top, and so I just like to make sure with the first pass that everything is nice and straight. Again, just being careful not to stitch over any buttons. I'm just quilting along, and I ran out of thread. So now I'm back and just quilting along. I thought it would be fun. I could sit all evening and watch quilting videos on YouTube and watching other people as they quilt their quilts, and so I just thought it would be fun and relaxing to show you this part of the process. I really do like the 2 layers of batting in this quilt. It really added such a great loft to this quilt, and it's not extremely too heavy. It is a little bit heavier than it would have been, but it's not so heavy that she won't be able to use the quilt without roasting up in the summertime. So I'm going to finish up this section with you, advance the quilt, and I'll show you when we get down to the bottom how everything looks. I thought I'd bring you along as we approach the bottom portion of this quilt and how I manage with 2 layers of batting and the quilt top to make sure that everything stays nice and flat. I like my quilts to be nice and smooth without a bunch of ripples in between the top and the backing. It's a little bit more difficult for me when you add a second layer of batting, but if you're patient and check with each advancement, you can make sure that everything stays exactly nice and flat. And here we are. My quilt is all finished with the quilting, and I'll show you that in just a second. So I thought I'd go over a couple things that I'm using today. The thread. You can see this big spool of thread. Let's see if we can see this label. Maybe you can pause it and read the label if you'd like to. I ordered this thread on Amazon, and it's categorized as serger and quilting thread. My favorite quilting thread is YLIUU. It's a universal quilting thread. It's very strong and great for memory and t-shirt quilts. So I had trouble getting a navy blue quilting thread from them. And so I went on Amazon and I found this thread, and it's AK Trading Company quilting thread. If you search on Amazon, I'll put a link to this thread in the description box if you want to check it out and read the description. So for the price of 1 cone of quilting thread by YLI, I got 4 spools of this thread, and it's 6,000 yards, I think, on this one spool, and you get 4 of them for the same price. And so I ordered some navy blue, and I tested it out on one of my own personal quilts, and it quilted wonderfully. I was amazed. And so, you know, not always when you spend less money do you get great results, but in this case I did. And so I've ordered white and black and cream and gray, and I've used all of those colors from them. And I think it's a great deal, and what I'd like to do is have at least 2 spools. And so I'll put 1 spool on my bobbin winder and 1 spool on the machine, and you'll see right over here. And that way I only have to wind 1 bobbin, and when that bobbin runs out, then I can just wind 1 more bobbin and keep going that way. Might be the lazy long arm quilter way of doing bobbins, but that's what I like to do if I have 2 spools of the same thread. And then I checked my tension. I always check my tension with the TOA, I guess that's how you pronounce it, the tension gauge. And then the needle that I'm using today is this one, and it's a size 20. You can see the label right there, and pause that if you need to. I like the bigger, thicker needle for memory quilts, especially this one, because we did use 2 layers of batting, and so you have a cotton backing, 2 layers of batting, and then the quilt top, and all of the quilt top except for the sashing and the border is clothing, and some of the clothing is thick. And so the bigger needle, I handled the thread fine, not one single skipped stitch or tension issue or broken thread. And so I just finished this quilt with all of the quilting. You can see the little button. Remember I talked about sewing on the button? There's that button. And we'll take a closer look as we go down. I think the 2 layers of batting really added a lot of dimension to this quilt. I think she's going to love it. And there we are. So I'm only halfway done with my day. I'm going to take this off the frame and square it up, trim away all of the extra batting and backing. I'll make some binding. I'll make a tag, and then we're going to bind this quilt. Welcome back. It's the afternoon now, and I just finished making all my binding. So there's the binding for this quilt, and just an update on the 3 yards from the first couple of videos that I was sharing. I have a little over half a yard of fabric left, so I do have some to go into my stash for another project or 2 or 3. So I just finished also trimming off and squaring up my quilt. So that's all ready for the binding. I have my binding made, and I'm getting ready to embroider the custom tag onto some ribbon. And so I do have a video of this. If you haven't seen it, I'll put a link down in the description box. So that will be embroidered with my initials. And for that I just use some Offray ribbon. It was the color of the backing and it matched great, so I'm going to use that. and some tearaway stabilizer underneath. I have some sulky dissolvable sticky interfacing on the back side of this, and just used the window technique to hoop some ribbon. So I'll go ahead and embroider the ribbon, and then I will start binding this quilt. Here we are putting the binding on the quilt. So here's my little tag so you can see what that looks like. That's going to get sewn right into the binding just like that. And so when we flip the binding over, it'll have a nice finished edge right there, and the tag will just go free. So that's really cute. That's an awesome idea, a good way to customize your quilts. Here recently, maybe the last 8 or 9 quilts, I've started attaching my binding to the back side of the quilt first and then flipping it over to the front. I've found that it saves me a lot of time, and I'm able to do everything while sitting right at the sewing machine, and I don't have to press the binding and glue the binding down. So if if you're looking for maybe an easier way of doing binding, try attaching it to the back first and then flipping it over and holding it down while you sew it. Maybe that's a good topic for a video coming up if I have time. I'm not sure. I start a new quilt tomorrow, and then I'll have 4 more quilts to do before we close on our house. But isn't this pretty, just being surrounded by a big, puffy, soft quilt? So I'm going to go ahead and finish up this binding, and we'll meet back when the quilt is all finished. Here we are, everyone, the finished quilt. So it's about 5:30 Monday afternoon, or Monday at dinner time. Let's see if I can back up and take a look. It's really too heavy to put back on the wall, so we'll have to get a look at it this way. There she is, all quilted, and the binding is all done. I really think that blue sashing and small little border really softens up this quilt and separates each one of the clothing pieces and lets them speak for themselves, sort of separated like that. So we'll take a closer look at the quilting. The gray thread is so neutral that it just blends right in. You don't even see any thread on the top. It just blends right in, and all you see is dimension and quiltiness. The 2 layers of batting really did add a nice feel and loft to the quilt. So let's take a closer look at my binding. There's the front. Remember, we sewed it on to the back and flipped it over to the front. And let's take a look at my finished little tag that I showed you. Let's flip over this way. There's my little tag, just like that. So I think that turned out really great. So tomorrow I start a new quilt, and I'm also sewing 2 pillows for a client. I say client, my clients end up turning into lifelong friends, and so really she's a friend now, but I've made several quilts for her, and she asked me to make 2 pillows, so I'll also be doing that tomorrow. But I've had a lot of fun just bringing you along and blogging or video blogging this quilt and the progress from the very beginning to see the finished product when we're all done. And I'm really sorry that I didn't hang it up on the wall. It's just, she's a heavy little quilt to be hanging up on the design wall. I've had a lot of fun with you. I can't wait to see you really soon. If you have any questions, you can type them down below. And as always, I would love to see what you're working on. So if you want to join me at the Creative Crew group on Facebook, there will be a link in the description box below. All right, until we hang out the next time, I hope you have a lovely evening. plane. Go away, plane. Go away, plane. Still the plane. Still the plane. Still the plane. Welcome back. It's the afternoon now, and I just finished making